Carey, can I just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you came to be working on the welfare state and pensions reform in the new Labour government in Number 10?
So I was appointed in 2000 and I was at Number 10 between 2000 and 2005. Appointed on a variety of sort of social policy portfolios. So that included children and families, but also pensions, with the Department of Social Security, as I think it was then, but what was to become the Department of Work and Pensions. There's one of the key departments that was my sort of shadow department, because we were sort of assigned particular departments as well as some parts of the Department for Education. And in relation to pensions, specifically, I was involved in pension policy really up until, I think it must have been about the beginning of 2003, when we then brought Gareth Davis in, who'd been working at the strategy unit, as I remember it. And that was great, actually, because that worked better because I could then focus on families and children.
So can you say, I'd like to start with the kind of context of Labour's thinking about the welfare state, if you like, which has been characterised very much as sort of belonging to the sort of social investment approach to welfare state, to say that there are new social risks like prolonged unemployment, lack of skills, lack of education, child poverty and so on, and those are different and distinct from the older social risks that the welfare state dealt with in the past, and we needed a new kind of investment-focused welfare state. And that appears, on the face of it at least, to have less intellectual, ideological space for thinking about social protection and benefits and pensions, perhaps in the way that had been the case for Labour in the post-war period.
I think there's a very specific, if I think about some of the kind of political legacy and then think about the kind of the wider ideological context, I think in pensions, or certainly in relation to the state pension, to some extent the legacy of Labour's 1992 defeat still sort of fed through, in the sense that the sort of anxiety about universal benefits and tax rises for raising those benefits, which was both pensions and child benefit, had such a rough ride and was seen to be part of the 1992 defeat, although obviously there's lots of question marks over that. Probably also influenced all the issues around the basic state pension and whether it should be earnings linked and so on. I think there's also the Social Justice Commission was strongly in favour of thinking of social insurance and national insurance. So the IPPR hosted and sort of drove. And of course, the welfare changes that then came into place, particularly after Frank Field, who was originally put in charge of sort of welfare reform, after he sort of departed, and the sort of, and I guess as Gordon Brown sort of asserted his sort of knowledge and role, that was really sort of ditched, and we then went down, the role that the role of tax credits, redistribution through tax credits, that became such a strong feature of Labour's policy. So I think there was sort of some key sort of changes from, in a way, some of the way the ground might have been prepared, or the way in which pension policy might have been configured at an earlier time. I mean, my sort of sense of sort of pension policy at the time is that it wasn't really informed by a wider discussion of the welfare state. And in a sense, I think, because a lot of the thinking around the welfare state was sort of driven by the Treasury and by Gordon, it was very focused on families with children. So there were sort of some changes in relation to pensions, but certainly at the point that I was there, that actually that was not the primary focus. And then there then became a very strong focus on pension credit and pensioner poverty, which again was sort of in line with the focus that Labour had taken.
Was that a consequence of a desire to address pensioner poverty, or that plus the kind of politics of, say, people like Barbara Castle, very active in trying to push Labour to doing more and different things on pension reform? Can you just account for why pensions became more important, perhaps in the later 90s and early 2000s?
So I think that there was the kind of big concern about pensioner poverty, and I think there was a realisation, and this kind of happens both in the run-up to Labour and through the kind of that early part of Labour years, that actually the pension settlement is no longer kind of fit for purpose, and that pensioners were falling behind in relation to living standards, that that the sort of private sector provision that was available, the sort of world of the large company and defined benefit pensions had started to feel much more precarious. There were some sort of significant insolvencies, and therefore there got to be actually just quite a lot of policy and political anxiety about whether actually where we had got to, which was a pension that was now delinked from earnings, that both large public sector and private sector companies were under pressure in relation to providing adequate pensions for people in future, and that obviously reflects changes in occupational patterns and changes in sort of industrial and economic structure. That all those and then people not compensating for that through their own decisions to save, that sort of really plus increasing longevity, that these were really kind of major changes that were coming together, that meant that the sort of reforms I think that had initially been anticipated were not bold enough to be able to solve those issues.
So in a sense you're saying that pensions reform was a response to those major challenges that were developing, but wasn't sort of seen as kind of part and parcel of a broader approach to the welfare state, whether it was asset-based welfare and the ideas about child trust fund, or whether it was child poverty and tax credits and incentivising people to work and rewarding work and tackling in-work poverty. Though the pensions was rather distinct, it had its own drivers of reform.
Yes, I think so. But of course, I'm also reflecting on the way, the sort of, I guess, probably my own personal kind of interests and drives, which was much more in this probably in a kind of family and children's space. So, there may be other people who would sort of locate it differently, but my sense of where the big policy and political narratives were, it was not particularly around locating the pensions within that kind of wider discussion of welfare state reform.
And so, just to take the example of child trust funds, which you were very heavily involved with, there wasn't a discussion then about, say, thinking how do families over the life cycle save for themselves, their retirement, but also for their children. I mean, these things were done in distinct tracks.
They were, and I think we thought about the Child Trust Fund very much through the sort of lens of children and young people, and then kind of giving them an asset that they could then use for a number of purposes for their future study and learning and employment purposes, rather than seeing it in an integrated way in relation to asset-based and savings-based policies. It is true, of course, that when I think that and thinking in terms of your role and David Blunkett's role, that it feels to me that was the sort of context. It was about inequality and trying to rectify asset-based inequality. When we then got to talk about the Child Trust Fund in the Treasury, then I think the civil servants then located it much more firmly in the policy around savings. And I do remember feeling there was quite a disjuncture about that, because I don't think that although it is about savings, I don't think it was located in the sort of pensions and savings kind of landscape. That's not where it began. You then got sort of competing sort of policy views about how that policy should be framed and located.
Can we have a look at how the Pension Commission then kind of gets established and establishes its role? Because that would have been around the time of the Green Paper. This, you refer to occupational pensions, but then it gets into something much wider in terms of referencing to expansion.
It's a really interesting lens also on exploring some of the differences between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, being Tony and Blair and Gordon Brown. And I know for some time, so I can remember when I first started at Number 10, one of the first meetings I had was sitting in the garden with Tony Blair, where he expressed his sort of concern about the basic state pension and the fact that there had been the 5p rise in the basic state pension, which had, politically very difficult. That's what RPI was. Logically, you could see where the Treasury was coming from, but very difficult politically. And in a sense, that sort of anxiety about what's happening to sort of a sort of universal part of the welfare state and people in the middle was something that TB was always very kind of front of mind for him. So that was an interesting sort of first conversation. And then, of course, that gets kind of played out later on in relation to thinking about how that pension commission was constructed. So although it was included, as a response, in a sense, to whether the voluntarist approach in terms of people getting incentives to save themselves was sufficient, there'd been a kind of a long-standing issue really about whether the basic state pension should be index-linked again in relation to earnings. That had played out between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And thinking back in relation to pension credit, I remember at the time that there was quite a lot of concern at Number 10, and again these were sort of quite sort of typical sort of differences about the fact that a concern about the complexity around of pension credit, and while I think it was supported, or we supported it because actually, and it turned out to be a highly effective way of dealing with pensioner poverty, it wasn't sort of dealing with the whole kind of question of pensions. And because of the sort of the deal about who was in control of which areas of government policy between the two of them, there was an incredibly strong view, which again obviously gets played out later more, about a sort of hands-off pension policy, hands-off anything that's around the basic state pension for Number 10 and the Prime Minister. That starts to change. So I can remember being at Number 10, and Tony would write these holiday notes, post-holiday notes. Now I guess that must have been the summer of 2002, but I'm not 100% sure. And that we came together in the policy unit discussion around the big table. Jeremy Hayward would chair, and he raised the issue of pensions, that in a broad way, that we were not in the right place, and wanting to have a much more sort of all-embracing look at it and what we should be doing about that, and a sort of, I think, a kind of illustration of political foresight actually, and a sort of instinct about sort of where the mood was. And so that kicked off then what then later emerged as the Pension Commission. But it was very difficult to get the Treasury to be prepared to include anything to do with basic state pension side, a policy to be included in that Pension Commission remit. And then, as there was then a sort of a sentence that was included in the remit of the Pension Commission, which allowed the impact of the basic state pension on people's incentives to save, basically, to be included. And that was a sort of win. I can specifically remember the negotiation of that sentence and conversations with Ed Balls, Jeremy Hayward, and myself about how we got that in, combined with sort of really interesting discussion about the commissioners. So I think, you know, the commissioners were, it was a really interesting and clearly what became, you know, a highly successful way of working. And the sort of Adair Turner obviously was felt like a very sensible choice because he'd also had a run at the Low Pay Commission, and had the sort of authority and credibility not only with the sort of business world because of the CBI, but with a kind of a wider set of sort of audiences and constituencies. And then Jenny Drake, coming from the sort of trade union side, and what I can remember is John Hills. I had thought that John Hills would be you know, an excellent sort of analytical mind, and a conversation with Ed Balls about including. So when we were negotiating about having those commissioners, a conversation with Ed to say, you know, we think, you know, John Hills would be a good person, and that he was sort of he was sort of quite happy and surprised that we'd suggested John as somebody, I guess, because there was a bit of the kind of guardianship of, you know, what was going on for poorer pensioners, you know, really right at the front of his mind. So all of that was quite fraught. And it is really interesting. I had a quick look at not at the announcement, but at the pension paper that was published in December 2002. And there's just a very, very kind of passing mention to of the Commission. So that sort of, I guess that you know, that negotiation with the Treasury was something that we obviously did across a whole kind of range of different issues. And at that stage, even though the intent from the Prime Minister's perspective was that it should be a big and bold commission, you know, initially its remit was quite confined, but because of the way it turned out, the way it worked in the end, it was able to actually to be big and bold.
So it was a quite conscious decision to keep the commission small,
yes,
to not go to another royal
yes,
commission, but to keep it
yes,
focused. And to have a balance of interests of the unions were involved, yes, from the start.
Yes.
As you say, Adair Turner with his kind, yes, of credibility in the business community, yes, but also, and to have the, you know, the unimpeachable credentials, yes, of John Hills, yes, as your social. And you can see on that basis why you'd then get a report which would have kind of lots of analytical and, yes, other credibility.
Yes.
Can you just say a little bit more about, you know, was it part of your thinking at the time that you wanted a kind of long-term consensus for this? Obviously, you had to deal with the issue of getting, yeah, consensus within the government. Was, yes, the primary concern, yes, obviously. A commission like this would be able to establish a settlement that would endure, because people, historically, Prime Ministers and others turn to commissions when they want something, yes, done that can endure.
Yes, yes. So I think it was part of that vision, and I think the you know, that Tony Blair had in mind that it should be, you know, because there had been a number of reforms, but they had all been, they were more fragmented. They were about specific parts of the system. There wasn't anything that was all embracing. So even though the terms of references were narrower than the report that they then delivered, I think the ambition was there from the start. But of course, you don't know. You don't know whether, you know, those commissions can come to deliver that ambition. And I guess what was interesting was, I think both because it was small, because it had plenty of time to deliberate. I think it's really interesting that the focus on data at the beginning, that, you know, there was really an ambition to kind of clear lots of kind of debris away and create consensus around what the nature of the problem was, and get agreement to that. And that clearly was a very sort of successful strategy that other things have then taken on as a model. And I think, I'm not sure it was seen at the time, but in retrospect, the sort of the use of data and the way in which that was sort of marshalled to make an argument, and the use of new data that now and new modelling that the DWP now uses as, you know, part of its normal business, in a sense, sort of foreshadowed some of the way we think about evidence and big data in public policy. But at that stage, I think was the model was always held by the Treasury. Now we have many income benefit tax models that are held by universities. That was a relatively new way of working, I think, in terms of the way it shaped public policy.
Further to that point, another kind of intellectual influence, if you like, was the kind of the first use, certainly in a big way in British public policy, of behavioural economics, of what became fashionable later, but certainly after the crisis as kind of nudge economics.
Yes.
That Turner was saying, if you leave individuals to their rational voluntary choices, they will not save enough, and we know that from this emerging field of behavioural economics. Were you kind of conscious of that at the time? Or did that come a lot later?
It feels to me that it came later. So that was absolutely sort of understood, and it was a really important sort of perception, a sort of a psychological perception of the way in which the policy had worked. But my memory is that wasn't framed in terms of nudge economics, and of course that came. It started to come later towards the end. I think the end of Labour, and sort of I think James Purnell was then pensions minister. Can't remember the exact timing, but I'm not sure that certainly wasn't at the time that the Pension Commission, I don't think it was framed in that way. So it feels to me more a retrospective lens than a lens at the time. But there may be others that think differently.
We mentioned a little bit the Prime Minister's desire to have a sort of an enduring settlement. Can you say something about then the sort of wider political consensus for it then? So obviously Labour loses office in 2010, but the reforms, although they get changed, they're basically implemented across that period.
Yes.
Nest is created, and the basic state pension is re-indexed to earnings and so on. Why do you think that was it the quality of the analysis and the fact that the policy frame was basically right?
Yes.
Why, compared to something like social care, for example, where the same process just did not happen at all?
No.
Why do you think it happened in this instance and not those others?
So it's really interesting to think why. I think so. Some is, and of course, given the kind of current context in which we're trying to operate policy today. So, it's very easy to take for granted that you have a government with a very large majority that has both had time to do some things and learn some lessons from it, and still really quite a considerable amount of time ahead of it. I mean, that doesn't answer the question why we didn't get social care right and we did get pensions right. But I do think was very important. So there wasn't the sense of having to get something, quickly sorted out. I think it's also a reflection of the roles of those institutions like TUC and CBI. I mean, the sort of corporatist kind of model of being able to solve social policy problems. It was slightly different because you had another, so you had John Hills as an academic, in other similar sorts of bodies. We had the voluntary sector more involved, as kind of equality bodies. It's interesting to think about whether today, in terms of the sort of the roles of those organisations, and particularly in the case of the TUC, whether they could play that representative role in the same way as was still possible, even despite the fact we were in this new era and it was new Labour. Actually it was a very good way of trying to broker political consensus that worked at that particular political period and moment. I think that there was there will be pension experts who would be able to say whether this was the case. My sense is that because the British system was more fragmented, that there had been good occupational pensions. There was SERPs, which was a really important pension reform of the 70s. There was an attempt to deal with pensioner poverty. But we didn't have, a brilliant earnings-linked state pension that really worked for everybody, that actually our base was a bit lower than possibly some of our European colleagues, that we therefore had to address something at a really, in a way that then was in advance of others, in advance of our peers. And then I guess also that because of the politics of the period and Labour's dominance at that period, that there was a shift to the centre, or the centre-left. And so at that point, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, were quite keen to share the same ground. And I know the Pension Commission, there was deliberate, there was engagement across political parties. And because in a sense pensions has been seen in the past as something that you have to have a consensus about because it's long-term policy making, that helped to create this important moment.
Can you just say something a little bit about, we've talked, as people will do, quite a lot about number 10 and number 11.
Yeah.
One other sort of department obviously that has a key role is the Department of Work and Pensions.
Yep.
Could you just say a little bit about their role in this process from the sort of inside of government?
Yes. So sort of overall, so not specific to pensions, but pensions included, I think, it was quite hard for the Department for Work and Pensions to sort of assert itself in relation to Treasury and the relationship between Treasury, the Chancellor, and then whoever was the Secretary of State at Work and Pensions. In fact, there was a sort of silent sort of understanding that whoever was appointed as Secretary of State in DWP or DSS as it was before, it had to be approved by Gordon. That was kind of Gordon's, appointment. So, and I think for officials it was quite difficult because they were often kind of running to keep up with whatever Treasury happened to be planning. But actually I think what's interesting about the Pension Commission is that starts to change. So I think both because the Prime Minister, really had this, a very strong focus and devoted a lot of time to the Pension Commission, and DWP were running it and running the commission, that actually you probably get a sort of a reassertion of the Department of Work and Pensions sort of role and some autonomy around what it was doing. And it clearly was, it was hosted by the DWP. So that's an interesting shift. And I guess just thinking about, what I think the reason that was able to happen more was because actually the Prime Minister was engaged in it in a way that probably it would have been left to Gordon at one stage. So I think that dynamic slightly shifts over pensions in particular. Yeah. I guess the only other thing that might be worth thinking about is older people themselves and their voice. And there were certainly some initiatives that sort of started at the beginning of Labour's coming in 97, that about giving more voice to pensioners. There were various kind of empowerment initiatives, and of course just kind of population-wise in terms of what kind of demographics and this hugely important voice and political power. And while I don't think that's that much discussed, I think it has to be an important part of why we couldn't kind of neglect that area of public policy.
Can I just a couple of things on that then, Carey? So the first was, as I recall, there was the National Pensioners Convention.
That's right, Rodney Bickerstaffe. Yeah.
So there was a kind of institutionalised vehicle which wasn't about the pensions industry or unions. And that was about older people having a
There was. And I can remember, Rodney Bickerstaffe coming in to see Tony and, having a couple of meetings. And, and part of that was trying to sort of maintain good connections with the unions and him, but it was also about the fact that he did have to listen to what we might not have agreed with it all, but he did have to listen to that voice. So I do think that's not insignificant. And I also remember we organised an event at Number 10 which brought together a whole sort of group of pensioners to talk about what their feelings and views were about what the government had done or should be doing on pensioners. So there was sort of an interest and view that you had to kind of understand and connect with this group.
And I suppose the other thing that's said about the Pensions Commission is the reason why the policy reforms are successful is everybody has to give a bit of something. So the working age population have to work longer, and the state has to improve the basic state pension, the industry has to lower its charges, employers have to contribute.
Yes.
In that equation, of course, older people are not vetoed. They're not being asked to, as in social care, for example, pay more inheritance tax or pay a capital charge. They are the beneficiaries of a settlement that others are coming to, albeit that, in some instances, paid people perhaps get less if you've got a flat tier pension than if they'd had SERPs, or if you've got to work longer to retirement, then if you're an older person, perhaps you have to waiting longer for your pension.
Yes.
But one argument is that older people then don't have a kind of veto on reform because everybody's contributing something, which means that they don't have a reason to block it. And whereas perhaps you might say that's the case in social care. Yes,
and also of course that there's this, the reforms, although bold, really huge reforms, but that take a long time to implement and are not. And many of the, in terms of kind of pension age, implemented after Labour were no longer in power. So I think, so it's interesting, whether it's easier for commissions to be more successful when they're talking about something that, takes longer to implement beyond their own lifespan. And also that, sort of today's pensioners, other than the earnings links, sort of the pensioners of the early 2000s or mid 2000s, it didn't initially, the policy was for the long term. And I think that probably makes it easier, and maybe then makes it also easier to achieve that consensus, thinking about it.